No tension, no traction, no action. If you don't understand your audience's tension, why they should care, you can't hold their attention, and ideas don't stick and turn to action. I'm Michael Bruner. I help technical professionals translate expertise into meaning and impact. In this video, I'll show you why tension drives attention, how it actually works in the brain, and how to find it for your own audience. Let's start with what happens when you don't have it. Don't present information, your what, without knowing your audience's tension, which is their why. Most people think their job is to present information, and this is where they go wrong. It's not your job. Your job is about connecting and conveying meaning from your mind into somebody else's mind. If you can identify your audience's tension, then you can craft your communication around that tension in a way that's meaningful to them. It can really transform your communication and your career. I've seen too many presentations go sideways. They lead with the technology, there's too many slides, there's too much information, and there's too much data. But without tension, you can't grab the audience's attention. So within minutes, the executives are checking their email, everybody else is mentally exited. So although technically brilliant, the presentation got filtered out as background noise. But after some coaching, we had a chance to do it again. And when connected first and framed with the consumer tension and the business tension, all of a sudden we had the business leaders' attention and the project got traction and funding. That's when the pattern became clear to me. No tension, no attention, no traction, no action. Everything changed when I stopped sharing information and started leading with why they should care. I started framing what the information meant for the business, for the leader, for the brand, for the consumer, for the organization, for the vision. That single shift changed everything about how my ideas were conveyed and how they were received. When you personally have your hands on a project, you become intimately familiar with the details and you can fall in love with the details. And then when it comes time to share it out, what seems important? Well, it all seems important because you've worked on it all, because you've touched it all, you know all of the intricacies. This leads to slide bloat and a meandering presentation that really doesn't land. The solution? Find the audience's tension and let it guide and craft your whole communication. There's no story without tension. Every compelling book, every movie, every story you've ever loved, every series you've ever got hooked on has a tension. I call this the law of tension. Without tension, the brain just loses interest. Not because the content is bad, but it just doesn't signal relevance, so the brain doesn't know to cue in. But if it gets interesting, if there's story, people lean in, people get curious, they listen. On YouTube, if a thumbnail doesn't have tension, doesn't really create curiosity, doesn't get clicked. Once opened, the video has to pay off that tension almost immediately, otherwise it's abandoned. The brain isn't being fickle, it's just being efficient. If it detects a mismatch, the information gets categorized as noise and it just moves on. The same rule governs business communication, even though we pretend otherwise. In corporate settings, attention is assumed because something is on the agenda, but it doesn't get the same rigor. The attention doesn't get earned, it doesn't get framed that way, it doesn't get protected that way, and people wonder why the information doesn't stick. Presentation is not boring because it's bad. It can be boring and not engaging for the audience because it doesn't signal relevance. The tension is the key to the relevance. The tension is what says to the brain, this matters. Think about a rope. A rope is just kind of boring if it's laying there, it's just not that interesting. But if someone picks up the rope and pulls on it and somebody starts pulling on the other side, all of a sudden it's interesting. There's a tug of war. There's energy, there's direction, there's stakes. There's an outcome to be decided. Communication works the same way. Without opposing forces, without reward, without an outcome to be determined, without a present reality or a future consequence at stake, there's nothing really for the mind to grab onto. Why the brain can't ignore tension. The brain isn't designed to process quarterly updates. It's designed to detect threats and opportunities and things that could impact your existence and survival. Every communication competes against this priority system, and most communications lose. Every second, your brain is processing millions of bits of information coming in from your sensory system. It's a lot. But your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, can only really keep track of about as much information as you can put on a Post-it note. So you need some kind of a filter, and that filter for the brain is the reticular activating system. It decides what makes the cut and what gets filtered out as noise. The reticular activating system asks just one question, and that question is, does this matter? Tension is how you answer yes, this matters. When there's a tension, there's an open loop in the brain. If there's uncertainty, it opens up neural circuits and it starts processing. When the resolution finally comes for that tension, the brain releases dopamine, the reward systems of the brain, and it says, hey, remember this solution. This is why the brain doesn't prioritize information. It prioritizes importance. And there's another reason that tension works so reliably. It's like a bloodhound. Once the brain locks onto a scent, once it locks onto a storyline, it wants to follow it. It wants to follow the trail. The mind is a pattern completion machine. When the tension is introduced and there's an unresolved gap, the brain begins predicting outcomes. It starts mapping out and simulating possibilities and figuring out where this thing can go. This is why people lean forward when there's a good story. They're not just listening, they're mentally participating. Their brain is actually trying to put them in the story and recreate it, which is why emotion can be so powerful in books and in movies. You start to feel and live through what the other characters are experiencing. When they're mentally participating, the brain is processing every new piece of information and it's evaluating it against the central case. Does this help resolve the tension? When it does, engagement deepens, and when it doesn't, attention drops. That's why a clear story thread matters so much. Once the tension activates the brain's prediction system, a detour feels like a broken promise. The mind disengages, not out of boredom, because the coherence was lost. Tension earns attention. The narrative continuity keeps that attention. That's why people binge watch shows late at night and why most presentations are forgotten before people reach the elevator. So we've established that the brain loves tension and tension is important. But how do you find your tension? And that's actually what this video is all about. It can be hard to find your tension, really hard to find your tension. I've facilitated many workshops, in fact, just for the sole purpose of finding tension for teams, finding attention for their project or for their program or for their brand or for their vision or for their organization. The tension can help craft the positioning for any of them. So here's the clarifying question. What's truly at stake? And if you think about it, and the answer is, well, there's nothing really at stake, well, that's okay. It's just that that's an email, not a presentation. The problem is when emails are disguised as presentations and people wonder what went wrong and why it didn't land. To find your tension, we need to really look at pains or gains. That's what's going to get the brain's attention. What are the pains and gains in an organization? And it could be anything from tension with a consumer or a customer, or it could be finances or regulatory or growth. It could be about talent. It could be about culture. It could be about speed, to name a few. If your presentations don't land, you can look down in the description below and there is a guide called the Tension Finder and can help you find your tension, and then you can use it to center and craft your communication. When you find a pain point that has a leader's attention, you know you're on the right track. Frame what you're discussing in terms of what they already care about. Don't lead it from your information. Lead from what they care about and their point of view. It's all about being audience-centric and the tension is the key to get there. If you're too zoomed in and working on all these details of the slides, you get way too close. A great leader and friend of mine used to call this the worm's eye view when you're down in the dirt. And the key is to zoom out and to look at a bird's eye view. If you can zoom out, you can better see what's important to the organization, what really matters, what's the broader context they're operating in, why it matters to the organization and the people that you serve. So one of my favorite ways to zoom out is actually just to physically stand up and walk away from my computer. It's amazing when I'm walking and reflecting upon the material, I'll oftentimes see the bigger picture and know how to connect it with the organization. The breakthroughs for me rarely happen at the computer. They usually happen when I'm up and walking. A second way you can try to zoom out and identify your bigger picture tension is to try to explain your topic to someone who's not involved in the project and let them ask some questions and probe. It's a great way to identify your tension. And a third way to zoom out that I really love is if you are at the computer, you can go into the PowerPoint slide sorter, or you can go to Light Table in Apple's Keynote. And what's cool about this is that you can see all the slides at the same time. And because of that, they get really small, so you can't read the details. It allows you to see the elements of the story and to design the story arc and story flow and reorder the information so that you start and end with the tension and engage the audience throughout. Once you find your tension, you need to strive to make it as simple as possible. If you can articulate it in one word or one punchy phrase or a sentence, that's fantastic. That's where you want to be. If not, you probably don't have clarity yet, and it's worth time to wrestle with it and struggle with it and fight it and rework it and pressure test it until it holds muster. A fuzzy tension is going to lead to fuzzy attention, and you're going to lose your audience. So once you have your tension, you need to design your whole talk and your communication around it. You need to introduce it, then you need to amplify it, and then you need to work to resolve it. The organizing principle behind a whole presentation should be the tension. It's not just an afterthought. Everything must serve it. Every slide, every piece of data, every chart, every example, every story, everything that you share, every anecdote earns its place by advancing and serving the central thread. So the first thing you want to do is you want to introduce the context. You want it to be brief. You don't want to say, oh, today we're going to reviewing our productivity metrics. But rather, every day that we delay this decision, we're losing 3 customers to faster moving competitors. See, it's immediate, it's specific, it's framing, it's personal. The next thing you want to do is you want to amplify the tension. The middle exists for one purpose, and that's to illuminate and amplify this tension before it's resolved. This is where the data goes. This is where the stories go. This sharpens your stakes. The middle needs to talk about not just what's happening, but it needs to talk about where you're heading. Every section of your presentation or your communication should answer one question. How does this make the tension clearer? How does it make it more specific? How does it make it more targeted? How does it make the tension more urgent? And if it doesn't, you need to cut it. Thirdly, you need to resolve your tension. Attention begs to resolve. You've opened a loop with the brain and it wants to know the answer now. As your presentation moves forward, you work towards how does it resolve your tension. Beware of the middle. The middle is the tricky part of communications. It really helps if you know your start and end. But the middle is often abandoned in terms of more background, more context, nice to know details. There's detours, there's asides, and this is where things get off track. It's very important to cut them and categorize them as noise. Once you've identified your tension, guard it tenaciously. Lastly, bookends. Bookends are a great way to anchor the tension. You anchor it in the beginning and then you resolve it at the end. Oftentimes, it's actually 2 versions of a similar story. So if you lead with, we're losing our ground to faster moving competitors, you close with something like, we're becoming the company that competitors will scramble to match. You see how they're 2 sides of the same idea? It's the same core idea with a transformed outcome. The audience should feel the distance from where you introduce the tension in the beginning and where you resolve it at the end. So bringing this all together, if you have the data, the polished slides, the confidence to deliver, without tension, your story can still land flat. It can all be categorized as noise without identifying the proper tension for your audience. The brain's asking, why does this matter? You need to identify your tension intentionally. You need to introduce your tension immediately. You need to amplify your tension meaningfully. You need to guard your tension tenaciously and protect it and cut everything else that doesn't directly support it. And then, of course, at the end, you want to resolve the tension transformationally. Your tension needs to answer the question, yes, this matters. So take the next presentation you're preparing and think about the tension. Ask yourself, what's truly at stake for the audience? With no tension, there's no story. With no story, there's no engagement. With no engagement, you just don't get traction with the brain. And with no traction, there's no action. The audience's brain is asking one question, and that's, why should I care? The tension is how you answer that question. If this was helpful, download the tension finder in the description below or learn more about the audience principle in the next video.